The summons arrived as a pressure behind the eyes. That was how Delegate Oren Mast described it later, in the 3 minutes they gave him. Not a sound, not a light, not a vibration in the floor or a tingling in the fingers, just a sudden, sourceless pressure behind the eyes, like the moment before a migraine decides to mean it, and then a room that was not the room he had fallen asleep in. He had been on Earth Station Remnant, Orbital Platform 7, which was humanity's polite name for the holding station the Conclave had assigned them after the banishment. 12,000 humans on a platform built for 8,000, orbiting a star they no longer had a name for because the Conclave had archived the star's original cataloging and replaced it with an administrative code. Even the sky had been redacted. What had once been a warm yellow point of light in the viewport had been reclassified as Stellar Body M447, a numerical designation that carried exactly the same amount of warmth as the procedure that generated it. He had been asleep, or something close to it. Sleep on the Remnant was approximate, too much noise, too much recycled air, too many people dreaming badly in adjacent bunks. The recycling systems ran all night and produced a particular bass frequency that settled in the sternum around 300 and made the kind of rest you could recover from feel slightly out of reach. Oren had been in the gray space between wakefulness and sleep for most of the past 3 years, if he was honest about it. You stopped counting the hours after a while. You started counting the things that still needed doing, and found that the list stayed roughly constant regardless of how you slept. He had been in that gray space when the pressure arrived, and the room dissolved. He stood now in the Omphalos. He had never been to the Omphalos. No human had been to the Omphalos since the banishment proceedings 3 years prior, and those humans had been the defendants, not the visitors, and they had not come back in any state that allowed for clear reporting. But Oren knew the Omphalos the way you know a place from nightmares, the specific, sourceless certainty of a geometry that should not be navigated. It was vast. It was old in the way that things are old when they have not been touched or changed or improved in so long that the original intent of their design has become theological rather than functional. The floor was some material that was not quite stone and not quite light, and it held his weight with an indifference that felt personal. The ceiling was not a ceiling. It was distance, dark, procedural, infinite in the way that filing cabinets are infinite when they hold the history of everything, and none of it is indexed for you. He stood very still. Not because he was frightened, or not only because he was frightened, but because the geometry of the place did something to his inner ear that made movement feel provisional in a way that ground beneath your feet was not supposed to feel provisional. He had stood in some strange places in the past 3 years. He had stood on the exterior maintenance gantry of Platform 7 during a pressure event, with nothing between him and administrative void in every direction, doing a repair that could not wait for the event to pass. The Omphalos felt more precarious than that. The gantry had at least been trying to hold him. He was not alone. There were 6 others, arranged at intervals in the circular chamber like points on a clock face that had lost its hands, all of them human. All of them, as far as Oren could determine in the first disoriented sweep of his gaze, men. All of them sharing something with his own face that he could not immediately articulate. The same general architecture, the same tired set to the jaw, the same particular way of standing still that said this person has learned to conserve motion, because motion has historically been expensive. The one nearest to him turned, and Oren felt the floor shift under him even though it hadn't moved. It was him. It was him and it wasn't him. The same face, older by perhaps 15 years, with a scar that ran from the left cheekbone to the corner of the mouth that Oren did not have and could not account for. The same eyes, but with something behind them that had resolved, the way metal settles after repeated heating and cooling, the same shape but no longer quite the same material, carrying more information in its structure than it had when it started. The older man looked at him with an expression of recognition that had already processed its own surprise and moved on. "Don't," the older version of him said quietly. "The geometry in here does something to your inner ear. Stand still for a minute." Oren stood still. He looked at the others, 6 men, 7 total including himself. 7 versions of Oren masked, spanning what appeared to be several decades, arranged in a circle in the omphalos of the conclave of unified sapience, which was the governing body that had banished humanity from recognized space 3 years ago, and had apparently found it necessary to reconvene on the subject. "Why are there 7 of us?" Oren said. It was not really a question. "That's what they call due process," said one of the others, younger than Oren, or at least less marked, with a jaw that still held some softness that Oren remembered having and then losing somewhere in the first year on the platform. 7 representatives, 7 timelines, 7 minutes total allocated for humanity's response to the resolution, 1 minute per representative. 1 minute per splinter in their language. "Splinter," said another one. This version was the oldest of all of them, white-haired, with hands that held themselves in the careful, slightly elevated way of someone whose joints had started making their opinions known years ago and had never really stopped. He said the word the way you say something you have been rolling around in your mouth for a long time and have decided not to swallow. "They call us splinters. Humanity is a splinter event. We fractured the expected developmental path of intelligent species, and they filed it under anomaly and never forgave us for fracturing." "What's the resolution?" Oren said. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape. The kind you can put your hands against in the dark and feel the edges of. "Permanent archival," the scarred one said. Oren understood what that meant. Everyone in the remnant understood what permanent archival meant, the way people who live downstream from a dam understand what a particular sound of stress fracture at 2 in the morning means even before they are fully awake. Permanent archival was what the conclave did to species that had been given provisional sanction and had failed, over a monitoring period, to meet the criteria for continued recognition. It meant that the species was officially reclassified as a historical phenomenon, present tense converted to past tense by procedure and vote. Their physical infrastructure would be decommissioned. Their population would be. The conclave's phrasing was relocated to a preservation context, which was a phrase constructed with such precise, humanitarian care that it managed to describe extinction without once using a word that felt like extinction. The way certain legal documents describe bankruptcy without once using a word that feels like ruination. Their cultural record would be sealed into the omphalos's deep archive and marked inaccessible pending an appeal process that operated on a minimum timescale of 300 years, by which point the relevant culture would no longer exist in a state capable of appreciating the appeal's outcome. Permanent archival, the clinical terminology of the end, managed from a desk. "They gave us 7 minutes, the youngest said. He had a bruise on his wrist, yellow-green, fading but still visible, that he kept turning away from the light with the practiced unconsciousness of someone who has been doing it for days. 7 representatives, 1 minute each, and then the tribunal votes. The resolution already has majority support. This is procedural. They're doing this because the charter requires them to do it, not because they expect anything to come out of it. So we have 7 minutes to stop our own extinction," Oren said. "We have 7 minutes to make a statement of record," the white-haired one corrected, gently, the way you correct something important when you want the correction to land rather than sting. What the statement accomplishes is a separate question. I understand that's how they framed it. Something shifted in the room. The 6 other versions of him looked at him with an expression that was uncomfortable to see on 6 faces simultaneously, because it was the expression he himself made when something had occurred to him that he wasn't sure was a good idea and was going to pursue anyway. He recognized it the way you recognize your own gait from a recording, Not the way you see your face in a mirror, but the way you see yourself in something you didn't know was being observed. "What are you thinking?" the scarred one said. "I'm thinking," Oren said, "that I want 3 of my 7 minutes." The conclave of unified sapients had been governing recognized space for approximately 4,000 years, as measured in the human calendar system that the conclave did not consider a valid chronological framework, but which had the advantage of being the only one that the people using it found comprehensible. It had 43 member species, each represented by a delegation that operated under the Omphalos Charter. The charter was an 800-page document that had been composed in the early formation period of the conclave by beings who had since evolved past the capacity for written language, and was now interpreted by a specialized cast of scholars who spent their careers in the Omphalos's sublevels, and were consulted on points of procedure with a reverence that was not technically worship, but had taken on most of worship's qualities over time. The conclave was, by every reasonable assessment, not evil. It was something more difficult to argue with than evil. It was correct. Correct in the specific way of large systems that have spent 4,000 years refining their correctness and have the track record to substantiate it. 43 species had agreed to live under a shared set of standards, and those standards had reduced large-scale conflict by 92% over 4 millennia. And those 43 species were, by most available measurements, thriving. Not in identical ways. The charter was sophisticated enough to allow for wide variation in what thriving looked like across different biologies and social architectures. But by the cross-referenced metrics the conclave had developed over centuries, the member species were, on the whole, developing coherently, sustainably, in directions that their own projected futures had anticipated. Humanity had come to the conclave's attention approximately 40 years prior, in the way that a specific kind of irregularity comes to the attention of a system that has been running smoothly long enough to recognize what irregularity feels like. Not a dramatic entrance, not a conquest or a catastrophe. Simply the gradual accumulation of evidence that a sapient species of some developmental sophistication had been operating in a region of space that the conclave's navigation records showed as unoccupied, and that this species had been there for a long time, and that they were doing things that were difficult to categorize using the frameworks the conclave had spent 4,000 years building. The processing had taken 30 years and had been, from humanity's perspective, profoundly bewildering. The conclave communicated precisely, exhaustively translated, cross-referenced, verified communication, with full documentation of every decision and its evidentiary basis, transmitted in formats that the conclave's linguists had spent considerable time adapting for human cognition. The problem was not comprehension in the individual word sense. The problem was that humanity found precision alienating in ways that were genuinely difficult to communicate to beings for whom ambiguity was a processing error, rather than a form of social texture. When the conclave sent humanity a message stating that their developmental trajectory required realignment assessment, humanity understood all of the words and none of the implication. When humanity responded with a message that spent 3 paragraphs expressing appreciation for the contact, 2 paragraphs on the history of their attempts to communicate with other species, and 1 paragraph of actual substantive response to the assessment request, the conclave's linguists recorded this pattern faithfully and clinically, and it did not help the case they were building. The banishment resolution, 3 years prior, had cited 17 specific failures across the monitored developmental period. Oren had read all 17. He had read them more than once. He had read them on his bunk in Sublevel 4 with the recycling systems running their 300 frequency, and the particular helplessness that comes from reading something accurate about yourself. The 17th failure, the one cited most often in the subsequent analysis period, the one that appeared in every secondary document he'd been able to access, read. Humanity demonstrates a consistent inability to internalize the consequences of their own developmental choices. Observable patterns of destructive behavior repeat across generations with statistical regularity inconsistent with species demonstrating adaptive learning. Each iteration of a documented destructive pattern presents as if occurring without access to historical precedent. This suggests a fundamental incompatibility with the conclave's foundational requirement of evolutionary coherence, defined as the demonstrable capacity of a sapient species to convert negative experiential data into long-term behavioral adjustment. There was not a human alive on Platform 7 who had read those words and not felt their specific truth somewhere dense and difficult, around the sternum or just behind it, because the conclave was not wrong. They were, in the frustrating and alien-specific way of something that is genuinely not wrong, not wrong. Humans did repeat themselves. The historical record was not a lesson plan with outcomes. It was a genre with recurring characters. You could document the same mistake across generations and know you were documenting it and continue to accumulate documentation, and the mistake would proceed to its known conclusion, and then the next iteration would begin, and you would get out your documentation again. The conclave had looked at this with 4,000 years of comparative species data in their archive, and had drawn a conclusion that was rational, well-supported, and had the advantage of being the kind of conclusion that a system this size could actually implement without ambiguity. Oren had spent 3 years on Platform 7 trying to name what was wrong with that rational conclusion. He could feel it the way you feel a wrong note in a piece of music you know well. You don't need to know the notation to know something is off, but explaining it to someone who doesn't have the song in their ears is its own problem. Every time he tried to put language to it, the language came out either too large or too small. He thought he might, in 3 minutes, have enough room to try. The other 6 looked at him in the omphalos for a long moment. The floor held them all with its indifferent, procedural patience. "You want to speak for 6 minutes," the white-haired one finally said. "I want 6 minutes worth of time to say one thing. That's different from speaking for 6 minutes. That's a semantic distinction that I'm not convinced has weight in a minute-by-minute allocation." "It has weight to me." Oren looked at the youngest, who was still turning his bruised wrist away from the light with that absent, practiced motion. "What were you going to use your minute for?" The youngest looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has prepared an answer and finds the preparation dismantled by an unexpected angle of question. He was quiet for long enough that Oren thought he might not answer. Then, "My mother sang to me when I was very small. I don't remember the song. I've spent years trying to retrieve the words and they won't come back, but I remember the feeling of it and I thought," he stopped. "I thought if I could communicate what that felt like. One mother, one child, one song. I thought maybe if they understood what that weight feels like, it might mean something. It was probably a..." "Give me your minute," Oren said. The youngest blinked. That's what you were going to reach for, the thing that doesn't file correctly into their record because it's not a statistic or a failure metric. You were going to reach for the thing that exists in the experience and nowhere else. Give me your minute and I'll make a place for it to stand against something. The scarred one was watching Oren with an expression that had moved past the initial reflex and arrived somewhere more considered. "What is it that you need 6 minutes to say that you can't say in 1? "I can say the thing in 60 seconds. I just need 60 seconds to build what it's standing on, or it's just a statement." Oren looked at each of them in turn, reading his own face in iteration, the white-haired patience, the scarred assessment, the broad-shouldered pragmatism of the one whose hand said he had been doing physical repair work for years, the quiet watchfulness of the one with the reader's eyes. 6 versions of himself who had arrived here, prepared to use their minute for 6 different honest things, and who were now looking at him with the same expression he knew from inside. The one that said this might be a bad idea, and I'm going to do it anyway because the alternative is watching it fail differently. Give me 3 of your minutes, he said. Keep 4. Say what you were going to say, but give me 3 and I will use them to say the thing I can't say in 1. The broad-shouldered one made a sound, short, percussive, not quite a laugh but in that family, and then said slowly, the way a man sets something valuable down rather than dropping it. All right. The others followed, the youngest first. The white-haired one last, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned to make decisions fully or not at all. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. Oren stood in the omphalos and felt the weight of 12,000 people settle across his shoulders with the comfortable familiarity of something you have been carrying long enough that the carrying has become part of your posture. He thought about dead men. Not literally, but the archived version of his species that the conclave's records already held. The entry for Homo sapiens, sealed at the time of the banishment proceedings, which described humanity in 17 counts of developmental failure, and in the clean, careful language of something that had already decided it, was describing a closed historical phenomenon. He had looked at the public access portion of that archive once, during the first year on the platform, when people were still trying to understand what had happened to them by reading documents that explained it. It had been like standing at a grave marker and reading the inscription of someone you loved, written by a stranger who had only known them by their debts. He was not going to let that be the last word in the record. He didn't know if he could change the vote. Probably he couldn't. The white-haired version of himself was right that this was procedural, that the resolution had majority support, and the testimony period existed because the charter required it, not because it was expected to change anything. He had 3 minutes in an 800-page governance system that had been running for 4,000 years, and he was going to use them. He started thinking about what to build. When the tribunal convened, it did so without ceremony, which Oren had been told was itself a form of ceremony. The conclave's particular way of communicating that this proceeding was administrative rather than deliberative, a formality in completion rather than a debate in progress. The 43 delegations arranged themselves in the curved tiers of the omphalos's upper chamber, which rose around the central floor like an amphitheater designed by something that experienced space nonlinearly, the tiers not quite symmetrical in any direction that human geometry prepared you to expect. There were no chairs. The various delegations arranged themselves according to their biological requirements for comfortable sustained positioning, which produced an overall arrangement that the human eye processed as chaotic and the human hindbrain processed as threatening. And the result was the specific quality of alertness that Oren felt in his chest as the chamber sealed and the arbiter's voice filled the room. The arbiter was not a being in the sense Oren understood the word. It was a function, a rotating role, embodied by a different member delegation each session according to a schedule Oren did not have access to. Today it was embodied by a keth, which was a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescent skin patterns, and had been generous enough to also provide audio translation for the species in the room that relied on pressure wave sound. The keth's audio output came through a translation device at the base of its neck, and emerged as a voice that was technically correct in every word and somehow still managed to feel like it was describing the world through a medium that filtered out something important. The way a high-quality photograph of a meal can tell you everything about the composition and nothing about the smell. This session of the conclave of unified sapience addresses the matter of Provisional Entry 779er, commonly designated as the Human Compact, more recently designated as Remnant Humanity. The resolution before the tribunal is Classification Omega, permanent archival of the designated species on the grounds of non-viable developmental trajectory. 7 representatives have been summoned in accordance with Charter Article 92, Subclause 4, which provides for testimony from the subject species prior to final vote. Representatives are allocated 1 standard minute per testimony. The tribunal will hear 6 testimonies, followed by a final allocation determined by the representative's internal consensus. The vote will immediately follow the final testimony. Begin. 6 minutes first, 3 held in reserve. The youngest spoke first. He had wanted to talk about his mother's singing. He talked about something else smaller in one sense, larger in another. He talked about the morning in Sublevel 4 on Platform 7 when the water recycler failed, and the 47 people who had spent 11 hours fixing it with parts stripped from systems designated non-essential. He talked about the specific sounds of that repair, the wrong tools against the wrong fittings, the particular swearing of people who know a job is possible but cannot currently see how, the long silences of sustained mechanical problem-solving. He talked about the moment when the recycler came back online and the water moved through the pipes again. He said there was a sound to it that he could not describe accurately, only approximately, which was that it sounded like relief made audible. He said 47 people stood in a corridor and listened to that sound, and nobody said anything for a long time. And then someone laughed. And the laugh spread in the specific way that laughter spreads when it finds a room full of people who need to release the same thing at the same moment. And people who had not spoken to each other in weeks were standing in a maintenance corridor, crying over the sound of recycled water moving through pipes. He said he did not know if that was legible to beings that didn't require water or didn't have laughter. He said he thought that might actually be the point rather than a limitation. He sat down. The chamber held the particular quality of silence that means many things are being processed simultaneously. The white-haired one spoke about iteration. He had the vocabulary for it that none of the others could claim, decades of watching patterns complete themselves, of living long enough to see the before and after of the same mistake, to hold both ends of the same repeated decision in memory at once. He addressed the 17th failure directly. He said he wasn't disputing it. He said the conclave's assessors had documented it correctly, and that he personally had contributed to the documented pattern more than once. He said that the repetition of destructive patterns across human generations was not a failure of information transfer. Humans knew their history, they had extensive records, they taught it to their children, but a failure of a different order, one he did not have a clean name for. Then he said this. The conclave's archive held 4,000 years of species that learned their lessons correctly on the first attempt. He asked them, before the vote, to open that archive and search it for discoveries, genuine paradigm-altering discoveries, not incremental refinements within existing frameworks, that had come from the species that never made the same mistake twice. He sat down before they could respond. The silence that followed suggested the question had found somewhere to land. The scarred one spoke about scars in a way that was not metaphorical, which was unusual and therefore effective. He described the physical process of wound repair, the cellular mechanism of scar formation, which is not restoration but compensation, the body's acknowledgement that the original configuration is no longer accessible, and its decision to build something functional from what remains. He said scars were not evidence of damage. He said scars were evidence of the decision to remain after damage. He did not editorialize. He let the biology carry its own argument. The broad-shouldered one talked about the particular knowledge that accumulates in the hands, not in the mind, in the hands. The kind of knowledge that cannot be transmitted verbally or documented or archived, that lives entirely in the physical memory of repeated manual engagement with resistant material. He had spent 3 years on Platform 7 repairing things that were not designed to be repaired repeatedly, and he said that his hands now knew things about the structural limits of the platform's core, alloy that no specification sheet contained, because the specification sheets had been generated by designers who had expected the platform to be used differently, and for a shorter period than it was being used. and the gap between those expectations and reality had been bridged entirely by people doing the work, accumulating knowledge that existed nowhere except in their hands and their experience of the platform's particular resistances. The one with the reader's eyes, the quiet one, who had been watching the chamber in the way of someone cataloging, spoke about language. Specifically, he spoke about 17 separate human cultures that had developed distinct words for the quality of light just before a storm breaks. He named them, several European terms, several from South Asian languages, several from languages that had fewer than 10,000 remaining speakers. He explained the variations in what each word specifically captured, not just light, but the quality of attention the light demanded, the feeling of the air changing in anticipation of weather, the specific emotional register that a human brain associated with that particular combination of sensory inputs. He said the conclave's assessors had documented this linguistic variation as evidence of societal fragmentation. He said humanity had always understood it as the opposite, as evidence that 17 different groups of people, in 17 different parts of a world, had all looked at the same sky at the same moment and found it worth the same careful attention, and had each reached independently for language to hold that attention, which was not fragmentation, but convergence expressed in parallel rather than in sequence. The sixth version of Oren, who had said nothing since the chamber opened, who had the particular stillness of someone who uses their words very deliberately, because they have learned the cost of the other kind, spoke for 40 seconds about one child on Platform 7 who had been born on the platform after the banishment, who had therefore never been to Earth, who had never known anything except recycled air and the particular light of administrative designation M447 through a viewport, and who had recently started drawing pictures on the sub-level corridor walls, not official drawings, unauthorized drawings in whatever media the child could acquire, pictures of animals and buildings, and weather patterns the child had never seen. The sixth version of Oren said he did not know where the child was getting the reference material, but that the drawings were accurate to things that existed, and that they had been expanding steadily for 2 years, and that Platform 7's administrative council had quietly decided not to have them removed. Then he was quiet for 20 seconds. Then he sat down. Then Oren stood. He had 180 seconds. He had spent the time since arriving in the Omphalos building and discarding and rebuilding what he needed to say, the way you take a machine apart in bad light, looking for the piece that is actually wrong rather than the piece that is most visibly damaged. He started with the archive. There is a record in this building that describes my species in 17 counts of developmental failure. His voice was steady, which surprised him a little, the way steadiness sometimes surprises you when you expected to need to hold yourself together. I have read that record. It is accurate. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. I am not here to dispute the record. The conclave's assessors documented our failures correctly. If anything, they were conservative in their enumeration. He let that sit. Not for effect. He let it sit because the next part required the first part to have landed, and the only way to know it had landed was to stop and listen to the quality of silence it produced. The silence told him what he needed. 3 years ago, he said, your assessors came to a world where every major inhabited center had a building with a door that stayed open. 24 hours a day, every day, across every seasonal and temporal cycle, the door stayed open. The building existed to receive anyone who came through it, people who had no other options, people who had run out of resources, people who were in physical or psychological crisis, people who were simply nowhere else with no other plan. Your assessors documented these facilities thoroughly. They noted the resources allocated, the operational logistics, the population served, the efficiency metrics of their function relative to the costs of their operation. It's all in the archive. The documentation is excellent. They noted everything about these buildings, except the reason the door was open. He could feel the chamber. Not in any literal sense. He had no way to read the delegations the way the Keth's skin presumably expressed its processing, no way to interpret the Vrethanacki's chromatic field shifts or the Mol-Torith subsonic resonance patterns. But there was something in the density of the attention, some quality of 43 delegations in simultaneous processing that was distinct from the silence before he stood, and he registered it the way you register a change in air pressure before you can name what caused it. He did not reach for sympathy. He was not here for sympathy. The door was open, he said, because a long time ago, long enough ago that the specific incident is no longer traceable in the historical record, a human being had nothing, and another human being opened a door, and the first human being walked through it and survived, and later, not always, not inevitably, but often enough to constitute a pattern, the first human being eventually opened a door for someone else. We have been iterating that act ever since. Not because the charter requires it, not because it is the most resource-efficient response to the condition of people in crisis, not because any developmental logic we have ever articulated demanded it. We do it because the door being open is the memory of someone who needed it kept alive in physical form. It is the record we keep in a medium that does not file correctly into your archive, not in text, not in code, not in any format that the Conclave's documentation systems were designed to receive. It lives in behavior. It propagates in the same way all of our worst patterns propagate, by repetition across generations that each discover the mechanism independently. Except this particular iteration opens doors instead of closing them. He was 95 seconds in. He had 85 left. 6 people behind him who had given him their time. 12,000 people on a platform they hadn't chosen, in air they recycled, under a star whose name had been replaced with an administrative code. One child drawing with her patterns on corridor walls. You have designated us a splinter, he said, a fracture in the expected developmental line, an anomaly that demonstrated 17 confirmed failures over 12 monitored governance generations, and which presents as a non-viable trajectory by the metrics the Conclave has spent 4,000 years refining. You are not wrong. We are a fracture. We broke from your developmental model before we knew your model existed, and we have been breaking from it in new ways ever since, and some of those breaks have been catastrophic, and some will continue to be catastrophic if you permit us to continue. And I can tell you that clearly and not look away from it, because the documentation already reflects it, and I have read the documentation. 55 seconds. But there is something not in the archive that I am going to try to put into language in the time remaining to me, because the record as it currently stands is complete, and it is not sufficient. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The Omphilos's acoustic properties were such that a person speaking at conversational volume was as present to the tears as if they were shouting. Your assessors could not document what it feels like when the water recycler comes back on. They can tell you it happened. They can give you the logistical narrative of 47 people over 11 hours, restoring a critical system to function. They cannot file the weight of 47 people standing in a corridor listening to water in pipes, because the weight of that moment does not exist in any medium that the Conclave's archive was built to receive. It exists in the people who were standing there. It exists in the fact that those people are still there, still on Platform 7, still in recycled air, still people who would do it again, are in fact doing it again continuously because the systems on a platform designed for 8,000 people and housing 12,000 degrade faster than they were built to handle, which means the work is ongoing and the 47 are, at any given moment, somewhere between 8 and 60 people, depending on the shift and the system. And they are doing the work. 30 seconds. You are voting on whether humanity is viable. I am not asking you to change the definition of viability. I am asking you, in what remains of this testimony period, to consider one question before the vote. What you are actually describing, when you describe a species that repeats its mistakes, is a species that does not stop, that continues to engage with the same resistant material across the same generational intervals, accumulating knowledge that exists only in the physical memory of continued engagement. The species that learns the lesson correctly on the first try stops engaging with that material. It files the lesson and moves to the next problem. The species that doesn't learn the lesson keeps going back, keeps putting its hands on the same resistant material in the same bad light. And sometimes, not always, not predictably, but sometimes, something comes out of that sustained, stubborn, repetitive engagement that could not have come out of the species that filed the lesson and moved on. Your archive does not hold it. Your archive holds what succeeded. We are what keeps going when success is not the available option. He stopped. He had 12 seconds remaining. He used them to stand in the silence of the omphalos and look at the tears, and not look away from any part of what he was looking at. The Keth's bioluminescent patterns moved through something he could not read. The Vrethanakis' chromatic fields shifted in a direction he had no framework for. The 43 delegations processed in the ways that 43 different biologies process, and he did not know what any of it meant, and he held still anyway. The 12 seconds completed. The arbiter's voice filled the chamber, and the procedure moved to its next required stage. Oren sat down. The vote took 8 minutes, which was longer than the testimony itself. Oren had not expected that. He sat in the central floor of the omphalos, while the delegations voted by whatever mechanism, 43 different species, used to register a decision within a system they had agreed to share. And he looked at his hands. They were not remarkable hands. They were the hands of someone who had spent 3 years doing the work that needed doing on a platform, where the work that needed doing was mostly physical and often dirty, and required the kind of knowledge that accumulates gradually in the joints and the muscle memory and cannot be retrieved by any other method. He had calluses he had not had 3 years ago. He had a small scar of his own on his left palm from a heat exchange fitting that had come loose during a repair in a space too tight to use the appropriate safety equipment, which had not made the incident less necessary to complete. He thought about the scar and what the other version of him had said about scar tissue. He thought about the child and the corridor drawings. He thought about the song the youngest version of him couldn't remember the words to, and the fact that the feeling had survived the words. He thought about all the things the Conclave's archive held in its 4,000 years of meticulous documentation of species that had developed coherently and sustainably, and in directions their projected futures had anticipated. And he thought about all the things the archive didn't hold, because it had been built to hold a certain kind of record, and humanity had been generating a different kind for as long as humanity had existed. The arbiter's voice returned. The resolution for classification Omega, permanent archival, has failed to achieve required majority support. Vote recorded as follows: 21 affirmative, 17 negative, 5 abstaining. The resolution fails. The matter of provisional entry 779er is returned to the Committee on Developmental Coherence for continued review. The review period is set at 15 standard years. Testimony record will be sealed in the Omphalos archive under open access classification, accessible to all member delegations. This session is adjourned. The chamber unsealed. The delegations began to disperse. 21 to 17, 3 votes. The resolution had failed by 3 votes. Oren did not move immediately. He sat with that for a moment, not in triumph, because this was not a triumph, and he knew it, and the 12,000 people on Platform 7 would know it when he returned. It was not reinstatement. It was not recognition. It was not a map with a name on the star they orbited. It was a procedural non-outcome. The resolution had failed, which meant the matter would go back to a committee, which meant 15 years of continued provisional status, which meant continued Platform 7, continued recycled air, continued administrative designation M447, continued doing the work that needed doing in the meantime. 15 years of continued existing. That was what 3 votes looked like. The 6 other versions of him dispersed in the way of things that belonged to different timelines. He wasn't sure of the mechanics, but they were present and then they were not, and he did not think he would see any of them again, because the specific configuration that had produced this particular 7 had presumably served its procedural function and would not be reproduced. He found himself hoping they got back where they came from. He did not know how to ensure that and did not have a mechanism for it. He supposed that was also a very human problem. He was picking up the youngest version's jacket, old, patched in 2 places, left on the floor of the omphalos by someone who had given away his minute and forgotten to retrieve his belonging, when he became aware that the Keth was still in the chamber. The Keth who had served as arbiter stood at the chamber's edge, bioluminescent patterns moving in slow, deliberate sequences. Its audio translation device produced a sound that Oren recognized as the unit activating for intentional communication rather than procedural announcement. 3 votes, Oren said. The Keth's skin ran through something he could not read. The delegation of Vrethanaki held an abstention on record from the original banishment proceedings, the device said. They had not filed a position on the current resolution as of this session's convening. They voted against, Oren said. They voted against permanent archival. Their filed notation stated, a pause, which Oren understood to be a translation pause rather than a rhetorical one, that your testimony introduced a concept for which the Vrethanaki conceptual lexicon contains no equivalent. The concept of a door maintained open as a record of need. The closest available approximation in Vrethanaki is a phrase that renders in your language as approximately the debt that improves the debtor. They found this concept merited further examination before final classification. The debt that improves the debtor. Oren turned the phrase in his mind the way you turn a tool in your hand when you're trying to understand what it was designed for. It was not what he'd said. It was not a translation that preserved what he'd meant. But it was something, a Vrethanaki equivalent that had no human word to map onto, that rendered the same territory from a different angle and found something worth noting in it. He folded the jacket carefully. He picked up the battered tool the white-haired version of himself had left on the floor. He couldn't identify its function. It was worn past obvious purpose, carrying its history and its weight rather than its visible features. He tucked it in his pocket. "Can I ask you something?" he said to the Keth. The translation device activated in a way that he read as permission. "In 4,000 years, Oren said, has a resolution at this stage ever been reversed, not returned to committee, reversed? Has a species that was coming to this vote as a formality ever changed the outcome?" The Keth's patterns moved slowly. "Twice," the device said. "In 4,000 years, twice." "What happened to them?" "Both cases remain in the open access archive," the device said. "You are permitted to research them." It was not an answer, but it was a direction. Oren supposed that was what he had room for right now, a direction, and 15 years to follow it. He started toward the exit. The omphalos's procedural indifference held his weight as it had held his weight since he arrived, without comment. The geometry still did something to his inner ear. He moved carefully, and he did not look back. The door was open. 3 weeks after his return to Platform 7, a message arrived through an unregistered frequency that took 2 days for the communications team to identify and calibrate for reception. When they decoded it, it was not from a delegation. It was from a single Vrethanaki who provided no name or position, only a communication that the Conclave's translation system and Platform 7's own linguists had rendered with one significant discrepancy between the 2 versions. The Conclave's official translation read, "Continued monitoring recommended, further review pending." Platform 7's linguists, cross-referencing the Vrethanaki conceptual archive, which was accessible through a secondary pathway the communications team had found by accident and spent a week verifying was legitimate, translated the same phrase as, "We are watching to see what you build next." Oren read both translations 3 times, sitting near the water recycler in sublevel 4, where the pipes made their particular sound, and the maintenance team had started a second round of stress fracture monitoring on the eastern coupling. He had done a shift on that coupling yesterday. His hands knew the specific give of it, the places where it had been repaired before and would need to be repaired again, the way it had learned to accept the wrong treatment and keep moving. He sat with the message for a while. He thought about what you build in 15 years on a platform you did not choose. In air you recycle. Under a star you are not permitted to name. When 43 delegations are watching to see what you build, and one of them has a word for what you do that translates to the debt that improves the debtor, and has no other word for it at all. He thought about the corridor drawings. He thought about the jacket under his bunk and the battered tool on his shelf, both still unidentified, both carrying histories he didn't have access to but could feel in his hands. He thought about 6 faces that were his own face wearing different kinds of damage, all of them still there. He folded the message and put it in his pocket. There was a shift starting in 20 minutes and they were short on the eastern coupling, and the stress indicators were showing a pattern he did not like. And the 47, currently 33, on this particular shift, in this particular configuration, needed someone with the right hands for a coupling that had been repaired before. He went. The water ran. The door stayed open. And somewhere in the Omphalos's deep archive, sealed under open access classification, accessible to 43 member delegations of the Conclave of Unified Sapients, there was now a record of 3 minutes of testimony from a species that had not learned its lesson the first time or the second time or the 17th time, and had still shown up to the chamber where its future was being decided and asked for extra time to say one more thing. The Conclave noted it. The species continued. The mistake in the door and the water in the pipes and the child drawing weather on the walls of the corridor, all of it continued, as it had always continued, as it would continue, as humanity continued, which was not the same as succeeding, and was not the same as thriving by any metric the Conclave had spent 4,000 years refining, but was what they had, and what they had was what they were building with, and what they built was what would be watched, and what was watched might eventually be named. And what was named might eventually find its way into an archive that had not been built to hold it. That was enough. That was, for now, exactly enough. What Oren did not know, what he could not have known, sitting in sublevel 4 with a message in his pocket and a shift starting in 20 minutes, was what had happened in the Omphalos in the 8 minutes between the end of testimony and the announcement of the vote. He learned it later, pieced together from sources he would not have expected to have access to, and which he never fully understood how he came to have access to. The Vrethanaki notation was the first thread. The second was a communication from the Keth arbiter that arrived 6 weeks after the session, which was itself unusual. Arbiters did not communicate with subject species outside of formal proceedings, and which was brief and precise, and which said only that the record of the session's deliberation period had been flagged for inclusion in the Conclave's standing archive of procedurally significant testimonies, a classification that had been assigned 41 times in 4,000 years. The third thread came from Platform 7's own people. One of the communications team members who had spent 2 days calibrating the Vrethanaki frequency. A young woman named Tessa Park, who had been 17 years old at the time of the banishment, and had spent the subsequent 3 years becoming the most skilled frequency analyst on the platform, by the simple method of having no other available use for her intelligence and working at it continuously, had, while calibrating, caught fragments of what appeared to be Vrethanaki internal communications from the period immediately following the Omphalos session. The fragments were partial and their provenance was uncertain, and she had flagged them as potentially compromised data. But Orrin had read them anyway, standing in the communications bay late at night when the frequency equipment made its particular sounds, and the rest of the platform was in the approximate form of sleep. What the fragments appeared to contain, in the Conclave's translation, and then in Tessa Park's secondary cross-reference, was a discussion among the Vrethanaki delegation about the specific phrase Orrin had used. The door that stays open. The debt that improves the debtor. The Vrethanaki had no prior architecture for the concept, which was why it had required a new phrase. But the fragments suggested that the absence of a prior architecture for the concept had itself been significant to the delegation. Not because they didn't understand it, because the absence in their own conceptual structure of an equivalent had pointed, in their deliberation, to something they had not previously identified as absent. They had a word for obligation. They had a word for gratitude. They had words for the various ways that social relationships created ongoing responsibility, and they had a sophisticated framework for the management of reciprocal duty networks that their delegation had applied in conclave governance for centuries. What they did not have, what none of the 43-member delegations had, as far as the fragments discussion could be reconstructed, was a concept for an act that created neither obligation in the recipient nor benefit to the actor, that was performed without expectation of either reciprocation or record, and that propagated anyway. The word the Vrethanaki had apparently been working on, in their internal deliberation during the 8 minutes of the vote period, was something the translation rendered as unclaimable gift. A gift for which no account can be kept, because the keeping of the account would change the nature of the gift. The debt that cannot be assigned because assigning it would cancel it. Orrin read that fragment late at night with the frequency equipment making its particular sounds and the maintenance shift visible at the far end of the corridor, and he sat with it for a long time. He thought about the open door. The thing about the open door, the thing he had not managed to say in 3 minutes because there had not been room for it, because it required more than 3 minutes of structure to hold it correctly, was that it worked only when no one was keeping track of it. The moment you began to count the people who had walked through the door began to feel like a transaction, and the moment it felt like a transaction, the act of keeping it open became a different kind of act. Not worse, not insincere, but different, changed in its nature by the counting, by the expectation that the count meant something, by the implicit proposal that a sufficient number of people walking through the door constituted a justification for the door's existence. The door did not need a justification. The door needed someone to hold it open. That was the thing the archive could not hold, not because the conclave's documentation systems were inadequate. They were extraordinarily adequate, among the most comprehensive information management systems in recognized space, and they had held 4,000 years of the most sophisticated species data the galaxy had produced. But the thing about an unclaimable gift was that the moment you put it in a record, you had changed it. You had assigned it an author and a date and a context. You had made it a datum, and a datum, however accurately it represented the original act, was not the original act. The original act was the person standing at the door at 3 in the morning when the door was supposed to be closed, deciding to leave it open anyway, for no one specific, for no quantifiable reason, because once the door had been open, it felt wrong for it to be shut. The Vrethanaki had spent 8 minutes trying to build a word for that during the vote period, and they had voted against permanent archival because the concept had no word in their lexicon, and they had found, when they looked for it, that the absence was itself a gap worth not closing prematurely. 3 votes. An absence in a 4,000-year archive that had been identified during the 8 minutes of a vote period in an 800-page procedural framework. Orrin folded the fragment printout and added it to the pocket with the Vrethanaki message. He would need to show it to someone who could verify the translation. He would need to show it to Tessa Park, who had found it and flagged it, and had probably already run 12 additional cross-references on it and was waiting for him to catch up. He would need to show it to the Platform Council, which was the 12 people who managed what 12,000 people needed to survive in a space built for 8,000, and which met every Tuesday and Friday in the large storage room on Sublevel 2 that had been converted to a meeting space, because no designated meeting rooms had been included in the platform's original architecture. The council would want to know what 15 years of continued review meant in practical terms. They would want to know what the Vrethanaki message indicated about the remaining 42 delegations' positions. They would want to know what the flagged testimony classification in the standing archive meant for the appeal process and its 300-year minimum timeline. He didn't have good answers for most of those questions. He had directions and 15 years and a communications team that had calibrated an unregistered frequency in 2 days, and a coupling on the eastern side of Sublevel 4 that needed hands that knew its particular resistances. He went to the coupling. He went because the shift needed him, and because he had the right hands for it, and because the water ran when the work was done. And the water running was what kept 12,000 people in their approximate form of sleep. And their approximate form of sleep was what they had instead of the deeper rest they were owed. And being owed something and not yet receiving it was not the same as it being unrecoverable. The coupling gave under his hands with its familiar resistance. He worked until the stress indicator settled. He stayed until he was sure. He went back through the corridor where the child had been drawing on the walls, and he stopped. The drawings had expanded again. New section, new material, storm weather over a coastline he recognized from a geography program he had watched years ago on Earth, before all of this, and a forest, and something he couldn't immediately identify. A kind of building, low and wide, with a particular architectural feature at its entrance that it took him a moment to place. A door, standing open. He looked at it for a while. He did not know how the child had encountered the concept. He did not know what reference material was making its way to Sublevel 2 that included images of open doors as architectural features of note. He supposed Tessa Park would know, or could find out. She had a way of finding things out that seemed to involve frequency calibration and patience, and the particular kind of intelligence that is mostly just willingness to keep working at the problem. He left the drawing where it was. He went to his bunk and put his hand on the jacket and the battered tool he still hadn't identified, and he lay down in the recycled air of Platform 7, orbiting a star with an administrative code for a name, and listened to the pipes. The water ran. In the Omphalos's deep archive, 41 cases marked as procedurally significant were joined by a 42nd. In the Vrethanaki conceptual lexicon, a working entry had been opened for a concept with no prior equivalent. In Sublevel 2 corridor of Orbital Platform 7, a child kept drawing. In 15 years or less, or more, because these things did not follow schedules, only directions, something would be built. Something was always being built. Something was always being fixed. The work was the same whether it was being watched or not, whether it was on the record or not, whether the door existed in someone's conceptual architecture or not. The door was open. That was the fact. That was the thing that went in the record last, and meant the most, and would keep going when the record was full.